Well, it's about a minute after. It looks like um, the people joining has slowed down a little bit. So I feel like we can probably go ahead and give a nice slow introduction as we get started. And that should give the last few folks some time to join in before we really get to the meat of things. So um, hello, everybody. I'm Ranger Andy Schnetzer from Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park. And this is going to be an amazing evening parked at home. We're joined by Ranger Claire Casey from St. Genevieve National Historical Park in Missouri. And there are 424 units in the national park system. That's a lot of places that we all need to go visit. And of those 424, 63 of them are national historical parks. And we've got tonight Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park and St. Genevieve National Historical Park. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have 3% of all of the national historical parks in the country right here on this Zoom call being represented right now. I don't know if you're as excited about that as I am, but this is amazing. I've known Claire for a little while. She's a park ranger there at St. Genevieve. But Claire is also an important leader in the National Park Service. She leads employee engagement and support initiatives nationwide. So she's not just a remarkable steward of our national parks, but she is also an agent of change in the National Park Service. And so we're very lucky to get to hear from her today. There we go. Look at that. The slides are working. So here we are tonight, parked at home. We've got St. Genevieve with us. Our two national parks are a continent away from, half of a continent away from each other. But there are some similarities. There are some things beyond the fact that we're national historical parks. Believe it or not, there are some other things that we have in common as well. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some context here in the Blackstone River Valley. And we're going to set the stage a little bit for what the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park story has going on with this evening's program. And then we're going to jump over to Missouri and we're going to hear about St. Genevieve from Claire for a while. And then we're going to come back and we're going to have some closing thoughts to see about some of these common American experiences that are that we can begin to find the connection between these parks. That's what we've been doing with this whole series, and we're definitely going to do that tonight too. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the Wayback Machine and zoom back a few hundred years and check out this map. This very, very accurate, extremely precise map that we can all recognize is the eastern parts of North America. And just to kind of orient ourselves a little bit, we always have the Atlantic Ocean there on the right, and all the way on the left is the Mississippi River. And we can look up here in kind of that top third of the map is the St. Lawrence River. And the St. Lawrence River kind of starts there in the Great Lakes and works its way east into the north and then goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. So just kind of below that, sort of in the middle, you can see there's New York, and we can start to recognize maybe Cape Cod and parts of New England and parts here that those of us here in the Blackstone River Valley are familiar with. And right along where that New England and New France line is there, we're looking at Maine, right? You can even kind of like squint a little bit and see the Kennebec River, and the Kennebec River, which is where Augusta, the capital of Maine, is now, was often kind of thought of as one of the dividing lines between an early part of New France called Acadia, and to the east, and then to the west was New England, part of the Massachusetts colony. And even the Pilgrims in the 1620s were traveling up to that Kennebec River area. And so we're looking at early colonial North America. And I think we have a pretty decent sense of the English that came here, right, settling New England. We've got the Pilgrims in 1620 and the Puritans in the 1630s, and then earlier than that, we've got the Virginia colonies further to the south. It looks like the Chesapeake Bay is huge here on this map. And then to the north in New France, the first French colonists to come over were looking for things that a lot of other Europeans were looking for in the New World, right? They wanted to get rich, they wanted money. And so what they ended up finding opportunity in was fur trapping and fishing. And so we think of Acadia and that northern eastern part of and you know the mouth of the St. Lawrence River as being very fur trapping and fishing heavy. But as you move upstream up the St. Lawrence River, King Louis wanted to establish more permanent settlements, and so he encouraged lots of farmers to come along. And so between Acadia and to the west and north of New England, right, you ended up with an area called Quebec. And the lower Quebec is to the east, and the upper Quebec is actually higher in elevation, right? So it's the upper part of the river for the Great Lakes. And Quebec even had its own city, right? Quebec City. And that was largely established in the mid to late 1600s by farmers. Now, this was a very different sort of system than sometimes we think of here in New England. The people who moved to Quebec, the colonists who settled there as farmers, they were in a bit of a more structured economic and social and cultural system than and on a larger scale than we might think of as these small New England colonies, which were surprisingly diverse from Massachusetts Bay to Plymouth to Rhode Island to Connecticut, New York, and down to Virginia, right? They had kind of different feelings about them. Quebec largely had this vast swath of a few folks who kind of controlled the economics and politics of the region, lots of farmers, and the Catholic Church served as a cohesive element to bind communities together. Now, on top of the farming and the fishing and the fur trapping, there was a very large missionary movement that was happening here to convert people to Catholicism. And so there we go. There's a little bit of New France and Quebec. And hold tight, in a few minutes, we're going to go all the way over to the left side of the screen there, and we're going to explore parts of the Mississippi River Valley. We're all on the edge of our seats for that, but stand by. Let's stay in New England for a little while longer. So as these farmers were settling in Quebec, many of them found opportunity for seasonal work or occasional work south. And so they would come down to Maine, to New Hampshire, and a lot of that work was logging, was forestry, was timber. And believe it or not, the tree cutting season in Maine is in the wintertime, right? So farmers could farm in Quebec in the summer, and then when it gets cold, head south and cut trees in Maine throughout the winter. They would stack the trees up on the rivers, and when the rivers would melt, then somebody would, ride the trees all the way down to the mills in the springtime. So there was opportunity for work in Maine and in the northern parts of New England for Quebecois farmers. And a lot of them would come home at the end of the day with stories about what America was like, what the United States was like eventually, right? And as these opportunities kind of expanded, you would see French Canadian Quebecois farmers that would come down not just for logging and wood pulp, but then also seasonal farming opportunities. And occasionally you had folks coming further down to work in the mills and work seasonally in the mills. And that brings us a little bit to a story that we're much more familiar with here in the Blackstone River Valley, which is how these mill villages began to form and the sort of social and economic structures that they were built around. So the first planned mill village in North America was Slatersville in northwestern Rhode Island. And we're going to come back to Slatersville again in a little while. But one of the key aspects of that planned mill village was that they had been using a lot of local labor. But as the mill villages grew and there was a demand for outside labor, the local mill owners began to establish what we call today as the Rhode Island system of manufacturing, right? And the key feature of the Rhode Island system is that whole families were kept together. And so early on, maybe some hardscrabble farm families could be convinced to sell the farm and move into the mill village and work in the mill. But when we think of the 1800s in America, we start to think of waves of immigration, right? And particularly in the 1820s, there was a potato famine in Ireland, and then again in the 1840s, another famine, and a lot of Irish immigrants began to settle in the New England mill villages. And as you can imagine, having this Irish Catholic immigrant presence through the valley really started to change the social structure of these New England mill villages and kind of formed often what we think of as these sort of closed mill communities that everybody worked together, everybody kind of lived together, shopped together, and spent their evenings and weekends together. And that is, again, the Rhode Island system of manufacturing. And this is going to become really important in about another 30 or 40 years. Occasionally during this time in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you would have occasional seasonal workers that would come down from Quebec and work in the mills. And these folks would return home to the farm and they would have a decent amount of money with them. And they often had new clothes and amazing stories of what it was like getting to work in the mills or working in the mills or living in the mill villages in New England. So the first Quebecois family to settle in New England, as the tradition goes, was the Peroul family, and they settled in Socket in 1815. And so that was maybe the beginning of this connection that people began to feel between their home communities on the farms in Quebec and the United States. And we're moving on to Slatersville and Northern Rhode Island. The beginning of the Civil War created a huge flux and change in the labor and manufacturing systems here in New England. A lot of the Irish mill workers decided to join the Union Army. There was a shortage of labor, and that was right around the same time that all of these big government contracts started coming in, asking for more goods, right? And so not only did you have a labor shortage, but you had a huge increase in demand for product. And that required the mill owners to fill that void of labor really quickly. Now, this was really interesting timing for the French Canadian families who maybe were starting to show an interest in moving to the Blackstone Valley. The system of land inheritance in French Canada usually meant that that every child of a family would inherit an equal portion of the farm. And so over the course of generations, farms became smaller and smaller and smaller, and somebody's farm might actually include different pieces kind of spread out from each other. This, with years of poor farming practices or of over farming the land, prevented people from having enough surplus food to either sell in the market or sometimes even provide for themselves. And very large families really dramatically increased how quickly all of this was happening. Similarly, a lot of Quebecois families ended up becoming indebted to the church because they were unable to pay their tithes that were required of them. So all of these things were kind of piling up on top of each other that, gosh, sure made New England mills look a lot more enticing to many of these families. And so the mill owners, not having to bring people all the way across an ocean anymore to work in this mill, now they could just go right up the road and bring people down, and it was maybe even less of a commitment that they could go back to their families if they needed to. you ended up seeing a huge influx of French Canadian families to the Blackstone Valley. And the picture here that you see on the right of the gentleman was not only a mill worker, but he also had enough land in Smithfield, Rhode Island, to have a farm as well. And so people could continue their traditions of farming. They could continue, of course, their religious practices and their traditions and the Catholic churches that were around. And you began to see not just Irish Catholic churches, but you started to see French Canadian Catholic churches. The French Canadians found that the Irish Catholic churches weren't serving their purposes. And so you ended up with these new infrastructures in New England as well to kind of support the community, the culture, and all of the economic growth that was happening at the time. Now, if you can imagine, this is America, and when change happens, there can be conflict. But for the most part, for a long time, you had a tremendous amount of population growth, a lot of immigration, and a lot of opportunity for jobs and work here in the Blackstone Valley. And so that's kind of like setting the scene for some future interesting events and opportunities and exciting things that happened here in Woonsocket and in Rhode Island by the early 20th century. But there you go. That's a little bit of the Blackstone Valley. That's why we got to here. And at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Claire. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
All right, great. And I will start sharing my screen. All right, is that showing up correctly for y'all?
Looks great.
Great, thanks. So again, I'm coming from St. Genevieve National Historical Park. And as Andy mentioned, we're one of the newest National Park Service sites that's been established. And so I will preface this with, we're still doing a lot of research, and I'm still learning as a ranger about a lot of this history. So when we get to the end, if you have questions, I may or may not have an answer yet. So that's part of the joy of doing this job. And since we're so new, a lot of you may not be familiar with where St. Genevieve is. So I've just changed the slide to a map that shows New France a little bit later on, closer to about 1750, which is about the time that St. Genevieve is established as a full-blown community. And so on this map, you can see that New France in blue here stretches from modern-day Canada all the way down to Louisiana. And that red dot there, right along the Mississippi River, that's about where we in St. Genevieve are. So we're very much in the middle of this French colonial empire that France was working on. And as such, and especially right there on the Mississippi River, St. Genevieve played a big role in connecting this huge network that they were developing and keeping things moving. Now, what this map doesn't show is all the indigenous nations, all the Native American nations in the area that do have longstanding ties to this region. We know that this was traditional homeland and has cultural affiliation for a lot of different nations, including the Osage, Peoria, Kaskaskia, the Delaware and the Shawnee, and others. So we're going to talk a lot about migration and border change, and keeping in mind that where a border was or who owned what land or who had the right to use it would have changed depending on who you asked in this region at that time. So the French had been coming from north to south, following that Mississippi River. So that's where a lot of the story of St. Genevieve starts. And there was a whole community of French colonists on the east side of the river first, as early as 1699 in this region. But similar, many of them were farmers. And in Kaskaskia, right across the river, or what was across the river at the time, it's now on the west side, they had been over farming some. And so their eyes started to wander to the west side of the river. And that's eventually what brings St. Genevieve into being. So we see French colonists coming over from the east, crossing the river to the west section. And this map on the screen here shows the settlement pattern that they use. This actually shows what we refer to as Newtown or New St. Genevieve. they had to move the town because being right on the river, you're going to have some trouble with flooding. So this is the new St. Genevieve, which is where St. Genevieve sits today. And you can see this traditional French settlement pattern. You have an area to the right along the Mississippi River that's labeled Common Field. And most of the folks in St. Genevieve were farmers. And Le Grand Champ, or the big field, is where everyone's farmland was. It wasn't common in the sense that you could farm anywhere, but everyone's farming land was in the same area. And what that did was it allowed people to build their homes closer together and have a more tight-knit community. And so that's a pattern that's a little bit different than we see further east or with other colonial settlers or folks who are moving to North America. And the other big thing here is it's somewhat towards the center is where the church goes. And that really reflects the importance, again, of the Catholic Church as an institution for the French colonists. And I mean, even from the name Saint Genevieve, it comes from the patron saint of Paris. And so just from that alone, you can see what influence the church and that part of the culture had on the area. Now, as I mentioned, most of the folks in St. Genevieve were farmers. And so the economy was largely based on agriculture. And being right there along the Mississippi River, that is an excellent spot for it, great, rich floodplain soil. And in addition to that, we have a lot of lead mines, or had a lot of lead mines in the area, and salt works as well. And these are things that brought people to this region forever, essentially. All those different native nations that came to the area came for very similar reasons. And the French colonists likely learned about those lead mines in those areas from the people who were already here. Now, these are very labor-intensive industries, and from the start, the French colonists also included enslavement within their systems. And so these industries were heavily reliant on enslaved labor. So we can't talk about the French colonial system without talking about that. Now, just like everything else, the settlement pattern, the culture, French enslavement was also a bit different from the British system that we're used to. Now, I do want to preface that different does not mean better. It's just a different system. And we have about 40% of the historic population of St. Genevieve that was people who were enslaved. Pretty big number. Now, that system was largely governed by what was called Code Noir. It was a longstanding set of laws that governed enslavement and were followed to an extent. People found ways around some of them, but it is a bit different from the British system. And we see, again, that Catholic influence in some ways. Things like people who were enslaved were not allowed to work on Sundays, or you couldn't break up families. But the definition of the family was largely dependent on being married in the Catholic Church and how old the kids were. So again, I don't want to give the impression that this is in any way better. It's just different. Now, the people who were enslaved in St. Genevieve were mostly of African descent, but being a part of this fairly international community in St. Genevieve, they also had people of Native American descent who were enslaved because of the existing native slave network that was existing in the region. This also means that as St. Genevieve grows, and as people do gain their freedom to an extent, we see that there's a growing community of people of color in St. Genevieve. So again, from the start, it's fairly international as these different people come to this region and kind of negotiate how they're going to share that space, or if they're going to share that space. And that gets even more complicated as the borders start to shift over the people of St. Genevieve. We go from being a French colony to being part of the Spanish colonial system, and then go back to French. And by the time the people of St. Genevieve know they're French again, they're actually American, because that Louisiana Purchase happens in 1803. That's a lot of change in about 40 years across the people who are living in this community. And each time those borders changed, new people would migrate into and out of St. Genevieve because of those political, cultural, and social changes that came along with those border changes. So we see things like people on the east side of the Mississippi River who were French colonists. Once that becomes British or firmly part of the United States, some of those people start popping over to the west side to be back in that French or even Spanish control. We also see things like native nations from the eastern part of the continent are getting pushed further west and start to come into the region of St. Genevieve and further west because of these colonial forces that are pushing them out of their homeland. And sometimes things like industry brought people as well. We have the Austin family, like Austin, Texas is in St. Genevieve for a bit because of those lead mines. So a lot of people chose to come to St. Genevieve, and some came through other forces because of the different things that were going on in this region because of these industries. Now, throughout those changes, we see that the French culture stays pretty dominant. French language especially continues, that Catholic religion continues, the way of building homes and living continues on in this very French way. Up until about the mid-1800s, when a huge German immigration comes through, and that starts to really shift the demographics of St. Genevieve. And we can trace a lot of these changes through one of the homes that the National Park Service operates. Green Tree Tavern is the oldest home that's standing in St. Genevieve, depending on who you ask. We do get a lot of different years for things, but it was built around 1790 for the Genevieve family. It was a French family that came over from Kaskaskia. And they built their home in this very French style, this vertical log architecture, which you can see in this picture here. So those logs stand straight up and down. And this again contributes to this French identity and this way of creating community through that identity. Now, the Genevieve family was a wealthier family, very prominent, and they did bring about 15 people who were enslaved with them. And those people would have likely done a lot of the work for the tavern and inn that were run out of this home at the same time that it was a private residence. But as these borders shift over the people, as the world changes around the Genevieve family and around Green Tree Tavern, we see many people are traveling into St. Genevieve, traveling through. Many people would have spent time here, would have been a community gathering place. But things do start to change. Now, under the Genevieve ownership, there is a woman who comes later from, we think, Virginia, although it's unclear exactly where she was from, who was also enslaved. Her name was Clarice, and she ends up enslaved at Green Tree Tavern until she gets her freedom a little bit later on in 1836, or sometime by 1836. And that happens after Francois Genevieve, the owner of this house, passes away. And the home transfers to the Ziegler family, one of those German families that came into St. Genevieve. They were a Catholic German family, likely coming from the region that borders France. So we see a lot of that, again, that draw to this French culture and finding some sense of community in that because of some similarities in the culture. Now, Clarice Rabeau goes down the road and purchases a home in her own name after she gets her freedom. And we see these names, Ziegler and Rabeau, show up again a little bit later on in the history of St. Genevieve. So if we take this story a little bit further into the early 20th century, we see yet another migration brought to St. Genevieve because of industry. This time it's the lime works. And many of the people who migrate to work at these lime works are African American, and they're coming from southern states, and many of them are Protestant. So it's a little bit of a different cultural background than the existing community. And this is one situation where conflict does arise. In 1930, things had changed quite a bit throughout the country. We're jumping ahead past the Civil War. We see Jim Crow becomes fully established, and the Great Depression has set in. And so there's conflict over who has what job and tension over having a job and surviving. And that cues up a large conflict in St. Genevieve. At this point, we have essentially two different Black communities in St. Genevieve. Those that have longstanding ties to the community, who may have some French heritage themselves, who have been there for a long time and are often Catholic. And then we have a new community that's coming in because of these opportunities with industry, who are coming from a different background and haven't been as connected to the town as long. And in 1930, this starts to come to a head when two African-American men are accused of shooting two white men. It's Columbus Jennings and Lonnie Taylor who are accused of this shooting. And essentially, two different stories come out of this. One makes headlines across the country as far as Connecticut and North Dakota, saying that Columbus Jennings and Lonnie Taylor had asked for a ride, tried to rob the two white men, Harry Pancho and Paul Ritter, and then shot them afterward. Now, Lonnie Taylor's version of the story was that, in fact, it was in self-defense because Pancho and Ritter had harassed Vera Rogers, who was with them. And then a fight broke out and then shots were fired. We may never know exactly how this started, but the end result was that two white men had been killed, and this started a kind of an uproar amongst some of the people of St. Genevieve. There was an armed group of white men who went around to these different Black communities and threatened them to leave. And in fact, most of those Black families did leave St. Genevieve, except about 2 or 3. Now, here's where those names come back in, because the sheriff at the time was Louis Ziegler, same family that had owned Green Tree Tavern for a bit. And he had to call in the National Guard to try and calm some of this conflict that was building up. And it was after the community found out that the second man who was shot, who had been sent to St. Louis for treatment, had passed away, that Louis Rabeau, Clarice's grandson, is kidnapped. His family was one of the families who stayed in St. Genevieve, and he was kidnapped because of that. He does get away from those kidnappers and is able to survive. He gets sent up to St. Louis for protection. And once again, the National Guard is called in. And eventually this does calm down. We see that the African-American communities of St. Genevieve are invited back, at least for those who were longstanding community members. But those migrant groups were never invited back to St. Genevieve. And we see that most people do return, Louis Rabeau included in that. But we also see that this has some long-term effects on the demographics of the town, and that many of those families did end up moving out eventually. So this is something that is a little bit more of a conflict than what we see throughout some of the other parts of this history. And we just covered about 200 years, which is far more complex than I can do in the few minutes that we've had here. And so I hope that maybe y'all can come down to St. Genevieve and learn more about this community and the complexities of each part of this story, and dive a little bit deeper into how communities change and how our neighbors moving in and out and trying to negotiate our culture and identity with the people around us is a constant ebb and flow in any place. And maybe you can connect to that in your own community as well. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we'll jump back to the Northeast. Oh, found the button.
Claire, that is amazing and fascinating, and thank you so much. And as it turns out, there's a question in the comments that is a remarkably good segue for us. And so the question is about the spoken language of the residents of St. Genevieve over time.
Yeah, so There's a dialect of French that develops in St. Genevieve that is still very French, but it's often referred to as Pawpaw French. That was the name that's given to it. So there's some aspects that are particular to the region, as people were speaking this language in an area where they didn't necessarily have words for everything they saw. And we see that that French language lasts and lasts here in St. Genevieve. And even through that German immigration, and as St. Genevieve becomes more German than French, many people still continue to speak French. And in fact, there are native speakers of French in the area, at least up until the 90s. There may be some who are still around. So that very much continued, and very much continued to be a part of that identity for the community.
Thank you. So I'm going to begin sharing again. Thank you, Claire, and welcome back to New England and the Blackstone River Valley, everybody. And we're going to have just a few minutes to kind of circle back around to what the early 20th century was like here with the clash of cultures that happened here as well. So 1924, the Mont St. Charles Academy was opened in Woonsocket. Now, I had mentioned earlier this evening that that on a local level, communities were really held together by the local parishes and by their faith and their Catholic organizations. And even so far as Catholic churches for people of French Canadian descent were in often same communities as Catholic churches for people of Irish descent or otherwise. And so the Mont St. Charles Academy was open as a school for Quebecois students, or students of French Canadian descent. And the original plan was for all of the classes to be taught in French. And the local bishop, William Hickey, was of Irish descent, and how much of an influence that had over his decisions is, I'm sure, still up for debate today. But he insisted that the courses be all taught in English and that French only be taught at the Mont St. Charles Academy as a foreign language. Well, when this decision was made, you can imagine a lot of the people who had contributed money over the years to have the school built, people who had participated in designing and building, and the people who were going to attend the school or whose children were going to attend the school had a lot of questions about that. And a local businessman and lawyer named Gagnon began to ask some serious questions, and he initiated the publication of a newspaper called La Sentinelle, which is the protectors, the sentinels. And even the title alone kind of like symbolizes that there is a break between these two cultures that are clashing, the local diocese and the local French Canadian community and families. And for a while, this became a media sensation. Now, I think it's important maybe to acknowledge that I am not of French descent. I am new to New England, and so all of this story is being told by a park ranger in a national park, and the best as I understand it. But I am sure that these are very powerful and important moments in history here. And so as these different pamphlets and newspapers were reporting on how all of this was unfolding, Dagnall even sent a letter to the Vatican, and the Pope did not directly respond, but the Vatican did respond and responded that the local bishop has the authority to make decisions like that within his diocese, and therefore if he decides that the classes are going to be taught in English, then that's what everybody has to agree with. those letters were then even published for everybody to read. I'm sure at the time people were really excited to pick up the next newspaper and find out what was happening. Dagnall upped instead of accepting that, right? He doubled down and he began to question how the funds were acquired to build this and how those funds were expended and where all of the funds went. It went to Rhode Island courts, and the courts in Rhode Island said, well, this is not a government issue. This is a private school. The separation of church and state doesn't really allow us to dig into this one. And so that's when Dagnall went further into the funding and said, well, this isn't a religious issue. This is an economic one. Things really got messy in the 1920s around this particular issue. Eventually, the Sentinels were excommunicated from the church. And after a few years, when the dust settled and everybody sort of calmed down a little bit, they were invited back into the church. But this was a really powerful and an impactful turning point in Rhode Island history, where this community in northwestern Rhode Island, Woonsocket, that was an economic powerhouse and a cultural powerhouse, and an important part of the entire New England region was in turmoil around this particular issue. And if you would like to learn more about all of this, here in the Blackstone River Valley, there is a museum dedicated to the French-Canadian experience here in New England, the Museum of Work and Culture, and it's in Woonsocket. So it's just right down the road. You can walk around and see the places where a lot of these things happened. And shameless plug in here, on April 22nd, Earth Day, the National Park Service and Museum of Work and Culture partnering for a 3-day of family activities and ranger programs. And it's going to be a great time. We welcome everybody to come down to Woonsocket, and I'll be there, and a bunch of us will be here. I wish we could get Claire to come down. That would be amazing. Maybe next year. So that kind of wraps up a little bit about the formal aspect of things, but working with Claire on tonight's program and kind of having conversations about what makes these two parks, which are so far apart from each other, right? 1,000 miles. Like, I should have looked that up. Like, how we are a long ways away from each other right now. And yet there's something, more than one thing. There are a lot of things that are surprisingly similar between the experiences that people here in the Blackstone Valley with this industrial story, and out there in Missouri with a farming and then mining story. There's similarities. There's something about immigrating to a new place and not only bringing what you have with you, but finding something different there as well. And I think there can be some remarkably powerful connections that we can all share with each other over those stories, whether those connections be personal or pleasant, or even sometimes painful and difficult. There's something fundamentally American about this, and national parks are a remarkably good place. They're not the only place, but they're a good place to experience this, to try to understand it a little bit more deeply and richly. And I hope that we were able to do that with all of you today. And yeah, Claire, so if I were to get in the car today and point the bumper west and start heading toward you, where should we go? What would a visit to your park look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We are about an hour south of St. Louis, so we're pretty within pretty good reach if you're in the area. The Park Service operates 3 of the historic homes in town: Green Tree Tavern, which you saw today, the Beauvais Amaro House, which is behind me here, and unfortunately closed right now because it's getting a new roof. but that's very important work. So hopefully it'll be open again soon. And the Jean-Baptiste Ballet House. And we do tours of those every day. We're open every day at the St. Genevieve Welcome Center. And if you come to town, you'll also see a bunch of other historic sites that are run by our amazing partners who are in town and who have been doing this work for a long time. And we're just the newest kids on the block. So if you come to St. Genevieve, there's a lot to see and a lot to do.
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. It looks like we maybe have a few minutes for some chatting and some questions. Mark, at this point, oh, I know, I've got one last thing that I want to say before maybe we stop recording and start having a chat conversation. Next Thursday, April 6th, the Parked at Home series is going to go north to Alaska, where we will be chatting at Klondike. And then on April 13th, 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to be heading back to New France, but a little bit further south, and we will be chatting with folks at New Orleans Jazz. So the themes are running all the way through the couple of months, and this is amazing. So we look forward to seeing everybody next week and the week after that. And again, thank you so much, Claire, and to St. Genevieve National Historical Park.
Thanks for having us.